The whip cracked once against the stone floor beside her, close enough that Alira felt the wind of it against her cheek. She did not move. She did not cry out. Her arms stayed locked around the small, shivering kitten pressed against her chest, and she lowered her head to shield it further, as if her own body could stop what was coming. "Drop the animal," said Mistress Colwyn, standing above her with her arms folded and her mouth pulled into a hard line. "You were told never to touch food that belongs to this house. You stole bread meant for the family and gave it to vermin." "She is not vermin," Alira said quietly. "She is starving. She would have died in the rain. And you will learn what happens to servants who think their pity matters more than the rules of this house." Alira had lived in the Colwyn household since she was 11 years old, when her parents died of fever within the same week and left her with nothing but the clothes on her back. She was 17 now, thin from years of small meals and long hours, her hands rough from scrubbing floors and hauling water before the sun rose. She had never known softness in this house. She had learned early that survival meant silence, obedience, and invisibility. But 3 nights ago, while emptying the kitchen scraps into the yard, she had heard a sound so small and so desperate that she could not walk past it. A kitten, no bigger than her palm, soaked through and crying in a way that sounded almost human, tucked beneath a broken cart wheel at the edge of the property. She had not planned to keep it. She had only meant to see if it was still alive. But when she picked it up, it pressed its tiny face into her palm and stopped crying, as though it had finally found something safe in a world that had given it nothing. From that moment, she could not leave it behind. She fed it in secret. A few crumbs from her own plate, a little milk saved from the pail before it was carried inside, hidden beneath loose floorboards in the small room she shared with 2 other servant girls. She told herself she was careful. She told herself no one would notice a few missing scraps in a house that wasted more food in a single meal than she ate in a week. But Mistress Colwyn noticed everything. It was her way of holding power over people who had none. "Kneel," the mistress said now, her voice flat and final. "You will kneel in the courtyard until I decide you have learned your lesson, and you will let that animal go, or I will have it drowned in the well myself." Something in Alira's chest turned cold and sharp at those words. She looked down at the kitten, whose wide eyes blinked up at her with complete trust, the kind of trust that only exists in a creature too young to know the world can be cruel. She thought of how it had curled against her collarbone every night since she found it, how its small heartbeat had become the only warm and steady thing in her life. "I will kneel," she said, "but I will not let her go." The mistress's eyes narrowed, but perhaps she saw something in the girl's face that told her this particular battle was not worth fighting in front of the household staff who had gathered near the kitchen door to watch. She waved a hand instead, dismissive and cold. "Then kneel with your pet, and we will see how much comfort it gives you by morning." The courtyard was made of old gray stone, uneven and cold even in summer, and it was already growing dark. A light rain had begun to fall again, the same rain that had nearly killed the kitten 3 nights before. Alira lowered herself to her knees in the center of the open yard, where every servant, every gardener, and every visitor to the house would see her should they pass. She held the kitten close inside the folds of her thin shawl, trying to keep the worst of the rain from reaching it, though there was little she could do to keep it from reaching herself. The other servants did not look at her as they passed. She understood why. To show sympathy was to invite the same punishment. In the Colwyn house, kindness was a liability, and the safest way to survive was to see nothing, hear nothing, and feel nothing. An hour passed. Then 2. Her knees ached against the unforgiving stone, and her fingers grew numb from the cold, but she did not loosen her grip on the small creature in her arms. The kitten had stopped shivering against her, lulled by her warmth and the steady sound of her heartbeat, and Alira found a strange comfort in that. Whatever happened to her tonight, at least the kitten was safe, wrapped inside the only shelter she had left to offer. She thought of her mother, who used to say that a person's true character was shown not in how they treated those who could reward them, but in how they treated those who could give them nothing at all. Her mother would not have been ashamed of her tonight, even kneeling in the rain, even facing whatever punishment the morning would bring. That thought alone kept her spine straight when every part of her body wanted to collapse. It was nearing the third hour when the sound of horses and carriage wheels echoed from the front gate. Alira barely lifted her head. Visitors to the estate were common enough, and none of them had ever once looked twice at a servant kneeling in a courtyard. She expected this night to be no different. But the carriage that rolled through the gate was finer than any she had seen arrive at the house before, its dark wood polished to a shine even in the dim evening light, its crest unfamiliar to her. Servants who had been standing idle suddenly straightened and hurried toward the entrance, whispering urgently among themselves. She caught fragments of their words. A duke. Unannounced. Here for the trade agreement discussions the master of the house had been anxiously awaiting for weeks. Alira lowered her head again, hopping the darkness, and the rain would be enough to keep her unnoticed. She did not want a nobleman's eyes on her humiliation. She did not want anyone from beyond these walls to see her like this, kneeling and soaked and shivering, holding a half-drowned kitten as though it were the only thing left in the world worth protecting. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. The carriage door opened, and a tall man stepped down into the rain without waiting for an umbrella to be brought to him, his dark coat immediately damp at the shoulders. He paused for only a moment as his eyes swept across the courtyard, taking in the grand entrance of the house, the flustered servants rushing to greet him, and then, finally, the small kneeling figure near the edge of the stone path. He did not move toward the house first. He walked toward her. "You there," he said, his voice low but carrying easily across the quiet yard. "Why are you kneeling in the rain?" Alira's heart lurched with something between fear and disbelief. No nobleman had ever addressed her directly in all her years in this house. She kept her eyes low, as she had been trained to do since childhood. "It is not your concern, my lord. Please go inside. The house has been expecting you." "I did not ask whether it was my concern," he said, and there was something in his tone that was not cruel, but simply unwilling to be dismissed. "I asked why you are kneeling in the rain, holding what appears to be a kitten, while everyone else in this courtyard pretends not to notice you exist." Before Alira could answer, quick footsteps approached from the direction of the house, and Mistress Colwyn's voice rang out, suddenly sweet and welcoming in a way that made Alira's stomach twist. "Your Grace, forgive us, we did not expect you until tomorrow. Please come inside at once out of this dreadful weather." The man did not look away from Alira immediately. His gaze lingered a moment longer, taking in the way her arms curled protectively around the small animal, the way her lips were tinged pale from the cold, the quiet dignity with which she held herself despite everything. Then slowly, he turned to face the mistress of the house, and something in his expression shifted into something far colder than the rain around them. "Perhaps," he said evenly, "you can explain to me why a servant girl is kneeling outside in a storm, while the rest of your household walks past her as though she is furniture." Mistress Colwyn's smile faltered for the briefest second before she recovered it. "A small matter of discipline, your Grace. Nothing that need concern a man of your standing. Please, let us go inside where it is warm, and I will have refreshments prepared immediately." "I asked a question," the man said, and this time his voice carried an edge that silenced every servant still lingering nearby. "I would like an answer before I step inside your home." Alira, still kneeling in the rain, felt something she had not felt in a very long time. It was not quite hope, because hope had been beaten out of her years ago by disappointment after disappointment. But it was something close to it, something fragile and trembling, like the first warmth of a fire before it has fully caught. For the first time since she had found the kitten 3 nights ago, someone with power in this world was choosing to look directly at her, instead of past her. And he was waiting for an answer. The mistress hesitated, glancing toward the house as though hoping someone might interrupt and rescue her from the question, but no one did. The rain continued to fall steadily, soaking into the Duke's fine coat, into Alira's threadbare shawl, into the stone beneath her knees. Somewhere in her arms, the kitten shifted and let out a small, weak sound, as if even it understood that something important was happening in this dark and rain-soaked courtyard. She fed a stray animal with food that did not belong to her, Mistress Colwyn finally said, choosing her words carefully. Rules exist in this house for a reason, Your Grace. If we allow servants to take what they please whenever sympathy strikes them, we would have chaos within a week. And so your solution, the Duke said slowly, is to make a starving girl kneel in a storm because she showed kindness to a dying creature. She is not starving, Your Grace. She is fed adequately, as all our staff are. He looked at Alira again, at the sharp lines of her collarbone visible even beneath her wet shawl, at the hollows beneath her eyes that spoke of years, not days, of insufficient meals. He said nothing more to the mistress. Instead, he crossed the remaining distance between them and crouched down in front of Alira, heedless of the rain soaking further into his clothes, heedless of the stone against his own knees. "What is your name?" he asked her, gently now, as though the coldness he had shown the mistress belonged to a different man entirely. Alira lifted her eyes for the first time, meeting his gaze directly, something she had never dared do with a nobleman before. His eyes were dark and steady, and there was no pity in them, only a quiet, burning anger directed at something far beyond her. "Alira, my lord," she whispered. "Alira," he repeated, as though committing it carefully to memory. "You may stand now." "I cannot, my lord. I have not been given permission." Something flickered across his face, an expression that looked almost like disbelief, as though he had never before encountered a person so thoroughly stripped of the right to simply rise from the ground. He stood slowly, turning back toward Mistress Colwyn, and this time when he spoke, his voice left no room for argument. "She has permission now, mine." The courtyard fell utterly silent, save for the steady fall of the rain and the small, uncertain sound of a kitten's cry, still cradled safe against a servant girl's heart. Mistress Colwyn's face had gone pale beneath the lantern light, though she tried and failed to keep her composure. "Your Grace, I do not understand. This is a matter of household discipline, not something that concerns a guest." "I am not merely a guest tonight," the Duke said. "I am a man standing in the rain, watching a girl kneel on stone because she showed compassion to a creature too small to defend itself. That concerns me a great deal." He turned back to Alira and extended a hand toward her, an act so unexpected that for a moment she simply stared at it, unsure whether it was truly meant for her. No person of noble birth had ever offered her anything but orders. She hesitated, glancing toward Mistress Colwyn as though seeking permission that she already knew would not come freely. "Take my hand," the Duke said, his voice softer now, meant only for her. "You do not need her permission any longer." Slowly, carefully, as though testing whether the moment might vanish the instant she moved, Alira placed her cold fingers in his and allowed him to help her rise from the stone. Her legs had gone stiff from kneeling so long, and she swayed slightly as she stood, but he steadied her without a word, his grip firm and sure. The kitten, still tucked against her chest, let out a small sound of protest at being jostled, and despite everything, despite the rain and the cold and the fear still coursing through her, Alira felt her lips twitch into the faintest, most unfamiliar thing, something close to a smile. "You are freezing," the Duke said, frowning as he studied her properly now that she stood before him. Her lips had taken on a faint blue tinge, and her whole body trembled, though whether from cold or from shock, even she could not say. "How long has she been out here?" he asked, turning his sharp gaze back toward Mistress Colwyn. 3 hours, perhaps, the mistress admitted reluctantly. "It is standard practice for—" "There is no practice that justifies this," the Duke interrupted. "Bring blankets, bring warm broth. Now, before I decide that hospitality in this house has failed me twice in one evening." The mistress's mouth opened as though to argue, but something in the Duke's expression silenced whatever protest she might have offered. She turned sharply and called out instructions to a nearby servant, who scurried off toward the house without needing to be told twice. While they waited, the Duke did not move away from Elira, as though his presence alone might shield her from whatever consequence the mistress still wished to deliver once he was gone. He studied the kitten in her arms, its small gray head barely visible beneath the folds of her wet shawl. "What happened to it?" he asked. "I found her 3 nights ago," Elira said, her voice still shaking slightly from the cold, though steadier now than it had been. "Abandoned under a broken cart, soaked through and crying. She would not have survived the night if I had left her there. And for saving her life, you were made to kneel in a storm. It is the way of this house, my lord. Kindness is treated as theft, and theft must be punished, no matter how small." The Duke's jaw tightened, and for a moment he said nothing, simply looking at her with an expression she could not fully read. There was anger in it, yes, but also something gentler, something that looked almost like respect, as though he were seeing not a servant girl but a person of remarkable strength, disguised beneath years of quiet suffering. A servant returned with a woolen blanket, and the Duke took it himself, draping it carefully over Elira's shoulders before she could protest that such a gesture was far beneath his station. "Come inside," he said. "You will not spend another minute in this rain." "My lord, I am not permitted in the main house. Servants use the side entrance, and only when called. Tonight you are my guest, not a servant of this house. And I am telling you that you will come inside through the front door, and you will sit by the fire until the cold has left your bones." Mistress Colwyn, who had returned in time to hear this exchange, looked as though she might argue, but a single glance from the Duke silenced whatever words had gathered on her tongue. She stepped aside, and for the first time in 6 years, Elira walked through the front entrance of the Colwyn estate, not through the narrow servants' passage at the rear of the house. The great hall was warm, lit by tall candles and a roaring fire that crackled in a hearth large enough to stand inside. Elira had glimpsed this room only in passing, through half-open doors while carrying trays or scrubbing floors nearby, always careful never to linger, never to be caught looking at a life that was not meant to be hers. Now she stood in the center of it, dripping rainwater onto a carpet worth more than she would earn in 10 years of labor, and she felt entirely out of place, as though she had wandered into someone else's dream. The Duke gestured for her to sit near the fire, and though every instinct told her this was wrong, that she did not belong in a chair meant for nobility, she found herself too exhausted, too cold, and too disoriented to refuse. She sank into the cushioned seat, the kitten still cradled against her, and allowed the warmth of the fire to begin thawing the chill that had settled deep into her bones. A servant brought a bowl of warm broth, setting it on a small table beside her with visible uncertainty, as though unsure whether this arrangement was truly permitted. Elira looked at it for a long moment before glancing up at the Duke, who had taken a seat across from her, still watching her carefully. "Eat," he said simply. "You look as though you have not had a proper meal in longer than tonight alone." She lifted the spoon with trembling hands and brought the broth to her lips, and the warmth of it spreading through her chest nearly brought tears to her eyes, though she fought them back fiercely. She had learned long ago that tears accomplished nothing in this house, that they were seen as weakness to be exploited rather than suffering to be eased. "Tell me about yourself," the Duke said, once she had eaten enough to steady the shaking in her hands. "How long have you served in this household?" 6 years, my lord, since I was 11. "And your family?" "Gone," she said simply, without elaboration, though something in her voice told him there was a deeper story she was not yet ready to share with a stranger, however kind his intentions seemed tonight. "The Colwyn family took me in when I had nowhere else to go. I have been grateful for that, even when the gratitude has come at a cost." "Gratitude should never come at the cost of dignity," the Duke said quietly. No one who takes in an orphan child does so purely from the goodness of their heart if they later make that child kneel in the rain for feeding a starving animal. Alira had no answer for that, because some quiet part of her had suspected the same truth for years, buried beneath layers of obligation and fear too deep to examine closely. She looked down at the kitten instead, who had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep against her chest, its small body rising and falling with each even breath. "May I ask your name, my lord?" she said finally, realizing with some embarrassment that she had never properly asked. "I do not even know who has shown me such kindness tonight." "Duke Alaric Valemont," he said, "though tonight I would prefer you simply call me Alaric if that does not trouble you too greatly." The idea of addressing a duke by his given name felt as strange and impossible as sitting by his fire had felt only minutes before, but something in his tone told her this was not a request born of vanity or games, but genuine sincerity. She nodded slowly, though she could not quite bring herself to use the name aloud. Not yet. Across the hall, Mistress Colwyn hovered near the doorway, clearly torn between the desire to intervene and the fear of doing so in front of a man whose favor her family desperately needed for the trade agreement they had spent months negotiating. When she finally approached, her voice had regained its practiced sweetness, though strain lingered beneath it. "Your Grace, I do hope this unfortunate incident has not colored your opinion of our household. We value our staff a great deal, and I assure you, tonight was simply a misunderstanding that has now been resolved." "A misunderstanding," the Duke repeated, his tone carefully neutral, though Alira could hear the edge beneath it. "I would be curious to hear how you define that word, given what I witnessed in your courtyard tonight." Mistress Colwyn's smile tightened, but before she could respond, the Duke rose from his seat, his height and presence suddenly filling the room in a way that made even the mistress take a small step backward. "I think it best if we discuss the trade agreement tomorrow, once I have had time to consider several things about this household that concern me a great deal more tonight than commerce." He turned back to Alira, who had risen as well, uncertain whether she was meant to remain or return to whatever quarters awaited her once his attention shifted elsewhere. "You will not sleep in the servants' quarters tonight," he said. "I have arranged for a room to be prepared for you near mine, where I can ensure you are not disturbed." "My lord, that is not proper. Servants do not." "Tonight, you are not simply a servant to me," he said. "You are a person who showed more compassion in one small act than I have witnessed from most nobles in a lifetime of court gatherings. That deserves protection, not punishment." Mistress Colwyn's expression flickered with something like alarm, though she quickly smoothed it into forced agreement. "Of course, your Grace. Whatever you feel is best." As Alira was led toward the guest wing of the house, the kitten still sleeping soundly in her arms, she could not shake the strange, unfamiliar sensation blooming in her chest, something she had not allowed herself to feel in years. It was not quite trust, not fully, because trust had been broken too many times before to be given so easily. But it was the smallest, most fragile beginning of something that felt remarkably like hope, carried on the quiet kindness of a stranger who had chosen, in a single rain-soaked moment, to see her as something more than invisible. Behind her in the shadowed hallway, Mistress Colwyn watched them go, her expression twisting into something far colder than the concern she had displayed moments before. She had not survived as mistress of this household for so many years by allowing servants to rise above their place, and a duke's momentary sympathy, she told herself, was not the same as lasting protection. Whatever kindness had been shown tonight, she intended to ensure it did not last past morning. Morning came with a pale, watery light that spilled through unfamiliar curtains, and for a moment, Alira forgot entirely where she was. The bed beneath her was softer than anything she had ever slept on, the blankets warm and heavy in a way that felt almost indecent for someone accustomed to a thin mattress and a single worn quilt. Beside her, curled into a tight ball on the pillow, the kitten slept peacefully, her small chest rising, and falling in the steady rhythm of a creature finally safe. For a heartbeat, Alira allowed herself to simply exist in the comfort of it, before the familiar weight of dread settled back over her shoulders. Kindness like this, she reminded herself, rarely lasted. She had learned that lesson too many times to trust a single night of warmth. A soft knock came at the door, and a young maid entered, carrying a tray of bread, cheese, and fruit that made Alira's stomach twist with hunger she had long ago learned to ignore. "The Duke requests your presence in the East Study when you are ready," the maid said, setting the tray down carefully. "He said there is no hurry." Alira ate slowly, savoring each bite in a way that felt almost foreign, before dressing in the simple, clean dress that had been left for her, folded neatly over a chair. It was plain, but finer than anything she owned, without a single tear or patch. She carried the kitten with her as she made her way through unfamiliar corridors, following the maid's directions toward the East Study. Duke Alaric was standing near a tall window when she entered, his expression thoughtful, though it eased slightly at the sight of her. "You slept well, I hope." "Better than I have in years, my lord," she admitted honestly, then hesitated. "Alaric," she corrected herself, testing the name carefully on her tongue. Something flickered in his eyes at that, something warm and pleased, though he said nothing of it directly. "Sit, please. I have spoken with the head of this household this morning, and there are things you should know." Alira sat carefully, the kitten settling into her lap as she waited, bracing herself for whatever news awaited her. She had learned that good fortune in this world rarely arrived without a cost attached. "I have decided," the Duke said, choosing his words with obvious care, "that I cannot in good conscience leave you in this household after what I witnessed. I have offered Mistress Colwyn a sum of money in exchange for releasing you from your obligations here, and she has agreed." Alira's breath caught. "Released? What does that mean for me, my lord?" "It means you are free to leave if that is what you wish. I would like to offer you a position within my own household, in whatever capacity suits you best, whether that is as a member of my staff with fair wages and proper treatment or something else entirely, should you prefer a different path. But the choice is yours, Alira. No one will force you into anything again, not while I have the power to prevent it." For a long moment, Alira simply stared at him, searching his face for the trick she was certain must be hidden somewhere within his offer. In her experience, no one gave without expecting something greater in return, and the idea that a duke might extend such generosity toward a servant girl with nothing to offer him in exchange felt almost impossible to accept. "Why?" she finally asked. "Why would you do this for someone you only met last night?" Alaric was quiet for a moment, considering his answer carefully. "Because 6 years ago, I lost someone very close to me under circumstances not entirely unlike your own. A young woman in my household who showed kindness to those who had nothing, and was punished for it by people who valued rules over compassion. I was not in a position then to help her the way I wished I could have. When I saw you kneeling in that courtyard last night, I could not simply walk past and pretend I had not seen what was happening. I refused to make the same mistake twice." There was a rawness to his voice as he spoke, a grief carefully controlled but still present beneath the surface, and Alira found herself believing him entirely, in a way she had not expected to believe anyone so quickly. Whatever his reasons, they were not born of manipulation, but of genuine, hard-earned conviction. "I accept," she said quietly. "Whatever position you have for me, I accept." Relief passed briefly across his face, though he was quick to mask it with practical matters. "Good. We will leave for my estate within the week, once matters here are settled. In the meantime, you will remain here as my guest, not as a servant of this house." News of Alira's changed circumstances spread through the Colwyn household within hours, and reactions varied wildly depending on who was asked. Some of the younger servants regarded her with quiet envy, whispering among themselves about the fortune that had fallen so unexpectedly into her lap. Others, who had known her longest and witnessed the years of quiet cruelty she had endured, felt something closer to genuine relief on her behalf, though they were careful not to show it too openly, wary of drawing Mistress Colwyn's attention toward themselves. Mistress Colwyn herself remained outwardly composed, accepting the Duke's payment with practiced grace and offering Alira nothing beyond a cold, clipped farewell devoid of any real warmth. But beneath that composed exterior, something far more dangerous had begun to take shape. She summoned her steward, a sharp-featured man named Edric who had served the household for nearly as long as she had run it, to a private meeting in her study that evening. "This cannot be allowed to stand," she said, packing before the fire with barely restrained frustration. A servant girl rising above her station, taken in by a duke, treated as though she were something more than what she is. If word of this spreads, others will begin to question our authority. They will believe that defiance is rewarded, that our rules mean nothing. "What would you have me do?" Edric asked carefully. "The Duke is a powerful man, but even powerful men have reputations to protect. If we can plant enough doubt about the girl's character, enough whispers about theft, about dishonesty, about ingratitude toward the family who raised her from nothing, his enthusiasm for her may cool considerably before the week is out." Edric hesitated, "And if it does not?" "Then we will need a different approach," Mistress Colwyn said, her voice hardening. "One way or another, that girl will learn that stepping outside her place always comes with consequences, no matter how far she thinks she has climbed." Unaware of the scheming taking shape behind closed doors, Alira spent the following days in a state of cautious wonder, adjusting slowly to a world where kindness did not immediately demand payment in return. Alaric proved patient with her hesitance, never pushing her to trust him faster than she was ready, content, simply, to prove through consistent action what words alone could never fully convince her of. They walked together in the gardens each afternoon. The kitten, whom Alira had finally named Wisp for the way she seemed to appear and disappear between the flower beds, trailing curiously behind them or riding contentedly in Alira's arms. Alaric asked about her life before the Colwyn household, and slowly, carefully, she found herself sharing pieces of her past she had not spoken of in years, the fever that took her parents within days of each other, the uncertain months afterward when she had feared she might not survive the winter at all, the strange mixture of gratitude and resentment she felt toward the family who had taken her in only to treat her as unpaid labor for 6 long years. In turn, Alaric spoke of his own losses, the young woman named Marielle who had served in his household years ago, whose gentle nature and quiet defiance of cruel rules had reminded him so strongly of Alira the moment he saw her kneeling in the rain. Marielle had been punished not for feeding a stray animal, but for sheltering an injured traveler against her employer's explicit orders, and the consequences of that punishment had ultimately cost the young woman her life, a tragedy Alaric had learned of only after it was far too late to intervene. "I promised myself," he said quietly one evening as they sat together near the garden fountain, "that if I ever again witnessed someone being punished for showing basic human decency, I would not stand by and simply watch it happen." Alira reached out, hesitating only briefly before placing her hand gently over his. "You kept that promise," she said. "Because of you, I am here and Wisp is alive, and for the first time in longer than I can remember, I do not wake each morning afraid of what punishment might come before nightfall." The moment stretched between them, warm and fragile, until the sound of hurried footsteps on the garden path interrupted it entirely. A young stable hand approached, breathless and clearly agitated, clutching a folded letter in his trembling hand. "Your Grace," he said, bowing hastily, "a message has arrived, urgent, from the capital. There are accusations being circulated about theft within this household, and your name has been mentioned in connection with covering up the crime." Alaric's expression darkened as he took the letter, scanning its contents with mounting frustration. Accusations of theft, he repeated grimly. And let me guess, the accused thief is Alira. The stable hand nodded uncomfortably. The letter claims she stole a valuable piece of jewelry from Mistress Colwyn's private collection before leaving the household, and that you have been sheltering her from justice out of misplaced sympathy. Alira felt the ground shift beneath her, the fragile peace of the past few days crumbling instantly into familiar, suffocating fear. "That is a lie," she said, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to steady it. "I have taken nothing from that house, nothing at all." "I know," Alaric said firmly, folding the letter and tucking it away with barely restrained anger. "This is Mistress Colwyn's doing, an attempt to discredit you and damage my reputation in the process, hopping to force my hand before word spreads too far among the nobility." "What will happen now?" Alira asked, fear evident in every syllable. Alaric's jaw tightened with grim determination. "Now, we prove exactly what kind of person Mistress Colwyn truly is, and we make certain that whatever consequences follow this accusation fall squarely where they belong." He turned to the stable hand. "Send word immediately. I want every servant in that household who witnessed Alira's treatment brought forward to speak the truth, whatever fear of retribution they may carry. And I want a formal investigation opened into the conditions within that estate, starting tonight." As the stable hand hurried off to deliver these instructions, Alaric turned back to Alira, his expression softening slightly despite the storm gathering behind his eyes. "This will not be easy," he warned her. "Mistress Colwyn will not surrender her reputation without a fight, and false accusations, once spoken aloud, have a way of lingering even after they are proven untrue. But I promise you this, Alira. I will not allow her lies to undo what has already begun between us, nor will I allow her cruelty toward you to go unanswered any longer." Alira looked down at Wisp, sleeping peacefully in her arms, utterly unaware of the storm brewing around them, and found within herself a resolve she had not known she still possessed after 6 years of silence and submission. "Then let her fight," she said quietly. "I am done kneeling for people who mistake cruelty for authority." The days that followed moved with a tension Alira had never experienced before, each hour bringing new messages, new witnesses, and new complications that threatened to unravel the fragile safety she had only just begun to trust. Alaric moved through it all with quiet authority, arranging meetings with local officials, gathering statements, and ensuring that Alira herself was never left to face the mounting pressure alone. The first breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A young stable boy named Corwin, who had worked alongside Alira for nearly 3 years within the Colwyn household, arrived at Alaric's estate early one morning, nervous but resolute, requesting to speak with the Duke directly. "I heard about the accusations," Corwin said, twisting his cap anxiously between his hands as he stood before Alaric in the study. "It is not true, Your Grace. Alira has never taken anything that was not hers. I have known her since she first came to that house, and in all that time I have never once seen her act with anything but honesty, even when honesty cost her dearly." "Would you be willing to say this before the officials investigating the matter?" Alaric asked carefully. "Speaking against Mistress Colwyn carries risk for you, Corwin. I would not ask this of you lightly." Corwin hesitated only briefly before nodding firmly. "I would. I have watched that woman punish kindness and reward cruelty for too many years. If speaking the truth finally brings some measure of justice, then I am willing to accept whatever risk comes with it." He was not the only one. Over the following days, 3 more servants from the Colwyn household came forward, each recounting stories of punishments delivered for minor infractions, of food withheld as discipline, of a household run not through fair leadership, but through fear carefully cultivated over years. Piece by piece, a clearer picture of Mistress Colwyn's true character began to emerge, one that stood in stark contrast to the composed, gracious woman she presented to visiting nobility. Mistress Colwyn, sensing the tide beginning to turn against her, grew increasingly desperate in her attempts to salvage the situation. She summoned Edric once more, her composure finally beginning to crack under the weight of mounting scrutiny. "This is unraveling faster than I anticipated," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "If the investigation proceeds much further, questions will be raised not only about the theft accusation, but about the broader treatment of my staff over the years. I cannot allow that." "What would you have me do?" Edric asked, though his own confidence had visibly diminished in recent days, aware that his continued loyalty to Mistress Colwyn carried increasing risk to himself should the full truth come to light. "Find something," she said. "Anything that might discredit these servants who have come forward. Debts, past dishonesty, anything that might cast doubt on their testimony before it reaches the ears of anyone with real influence." But Edric, watching the mounting evidence against his mistress with growing unease, found himself hesitating for the first time in his many years of loyal service. He had followed her instructions without question for so long that the habit of obedience ran deep, but something about this particular request unsettled him in a way previous demands never had. "Mistress," he said carefully, "perhaps it would be wiser to simply admit fault regarding the accusation and hope for leniency, rather than risk deeper scrutiny by attempting further deception." Mistress Colwyn's eyes flashed with fury at the suggestion. "Leniency? From a duke who has already decided to champion that girl's cause. You expect mercy from a man determined to see me ruined." "I expect," Edric said slowly, choosing his next words with unusual care, "that continued deception will only worsen whatever consequences ultimately await you, mistress. I have served this household faithfully for many years, but I find myself unable to continue supporting actions I know to be deeply wrong." The tension between them stretched taut before Mistress Colwyn finally waved him away with a dismissive, furious gesture, though something in her expression suggested she recognized, even then, that her control over the situation was slipping rapidly beyond recovery. Meanwhile, at Alaric's estate, Alira found herself grappling with emotions far more complicated than simple relief at the mounting evidence in her favor. Each new testimony from her former fellow servants brought back memories she had spent years trying to bury, memories of cold nights, of harsh words, of the particular loneliness that came from being surrounded by others who shared her suffering, but were too afraid to acknowledge it openly. "You seem troubled," Alaric observed one evening, finding her seated alone near the garden fountain, Wisp curled contentedly in her lap while she stared unseeingly at the water's rippling surface. "I keep thinking about all the years before this," she admitted quietly. "All the times I told myself the treatment was normal, that I deserved nothing better, that gratitude for being taken in at all should outweigh any complaint about how I was treated afterward. Hearing others speak the truth so openly now makes me realize how deeply I had convinced myself to accept something I never should have accepted." Alaric sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, though he was careful never to press closer than she seemed comfortable with. "You survived circumstances that would have broken many people entirely," he said gently. "The fact that you maintained your compassion, your capacity for kindness even toward a helpless creature, despite years of cruelty directed at you, speaks to a strength I have rarely encountered in anyone, noble or servant alike." "I do not feel strong," she said softly. "Most days, I feel as though I am simply waiting for this to be taken away from me too, the way everything good in my life eventually has been." "It will not be taken away," Alaric said firmly, "not while I have breath in my body to prevent it." She turned to look at him then, searching his face in the fading evening light, and found there nothing but sincerity, unclouded by any hidden motive or expectation of repayment. Slowly, tentatively, she allowed herself to lean slightly against his shoulder, and he did not move away, simply remained still and steady beside her as the last light of evening faded into stars overhead. Word of the investigation eventually reached beyond local circles, drawing the attention of a regional magistrate who had jurisdiction over matters involving noble households and their treatment of staff. A formal hearing was scheduled, one that would require both Mistress Colwyn and Alira to appear before the magistrate, along with any witnesses willing to testify on either side. The night before the hearing, Alira found herself unable to sleep, anxiety twisting through her stomach despite Alaric's repeated reassurances that the evidence overwhelmingly supported her innocence. She rose quietly, careful not to disturb Wisp, and made her way to the study, where she found Alaric still awake, reviewing documents by candlelight. "You should be resting," he said gently, looking up as she entered. "I cannot," she admitted. "Tomorrow feels as though it will determine everything, and I am terrified of what happens if the magistrate does not believe the truth." Alaric set down his papers and rose to meet her, taking her hands gently in his own. "Whatever happens tomorrow, Alira, know that the truth is on our side, supported by multiple witnesses whose testimony cannot easily be dismissed. But even beyond that, know that regardless of the magistrate's decision, I will not abandon you to face consequences for a crime you did not commit. Whatever protection remains within my power, you will have it." "Why do you care so much?" she asked quietly, the question she had carried since that first rain-soaked night finally spilling free. "I am no one of importance, a servant girl with nothing to offer someone of your standing." "You are wrong about that," Alaric said softly. "In the short time I have known you, you have shown me more genuine courage, more unshakable kindness, than I have witnessed in years spent among nobility who possess everything material and nothing of true character. I care because you deserve to be cared for, Alira, not because of anything you can offer me in return, but simply because of who you are." Tears she had held back for days finally slipped free, and this time she did not fight them. Alaric drew her gently into an embrace, and she allowed herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to simply be held, to simply feel safe, without calculating what cost such comfort might carry. "Tomorrow," he murmured against her hair, "we face this together. Whatever happens, you will not stand alone." Outside, the night stretched dark and quiet around the estate, but within the study, wrapped in unexpected warmth and hard-won trust, Alira found herself daring to believe, just slightly, that perhaps her future held more than simply surviving one cruelty after another. The hearing room was crowded by the time Alira arrived, its high windows letting in pale morning light that did little to ease the tightness in her chest. She sat beside Alaric near the front of the chamber, Wisp left safely behind at the estate under the care of a kind, stable hand, and watched as the magistrate, an older woman named Prudence Ashworth with sharp eyes and an unhurried manner, took her seat at the front of the room. Mistress Colwyn arrived shortly after, dressed in her finest clothing, her expression composed into careful, practiced dignity, though Alira noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she took her seat across the aisle. Beside her sat Edric, though his posture radiated discomfort rather than loyal support, and Alira wondered whether his willingness to continue standing beside his mistress had finally begun to waver. "We are gathered today," Magistrate Ashworth began, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed chamber, "to examine accusations of theft brought against Alira, formerly of the Colwyn household, alongside broader concerns raised regarding the treatment of staff within that same household. I have reviewed the written statements submitted this past week, but I would like to hear testimony directly before rendering any judgment." One by one, the servants who had come forward were called to speak, each recounting their experiences within the Colwyn household, with a steadiness that seemed to grow stronger as each new voice added weight to the collective testimony. Corwin spoke first, his earlier nervousness replaced by quiet determination as he described years of witnessing harsh punishments delivered for minor, often entirely reasonable infractions. "I have never known Alira to take anything that was not hers," he said firmly. "In 3 years working alongside her, I witnessed only kindness from her, even toward those who showed her none in return. 2 more former servants echoed similar testimony, describing specific instances of punishment they had witnessed, painting a picture of a household governed by fear rather than fair discipline. Mistress Colwyn's composure cracked further with each new account, her carefully maintained dignity fraying visibly before the assembled room. When it came time for Mistress Colwyn to respond to the accusations, she attempted first to dismiss the testimony as exaggeration born of resentment, claiming her former servants harbored grudges against a household that had, in her words, provided them with far more than they might have found elsewhere. But Magistrate Ashworth, sharp questioning, quickly exposed inconsistencies in her account, particularly regarding the alleged theft itself. "You claim a piece of jewelry went missing from your private collection," the magistrate said, studying Mistress Colwyn carefully. "Yet you did not report this theft until 3 days after the girl's departure from your household, and only after the Duke had already announced his intention to employ her within his own estate. Can you explain this delay?" Mistress Colwyn's mouth opened, then closed again, clearly struggling to formulate an answer that might satisfy the magistrate's obvious skepticism. "I was occupied with other matters," she finally offered, though the excuse sounded weak even to Alira's ears. "I see," Magistrate Ashworth said, her tone making clear she found the explanation entirely unconvincing. "And do you have any physical evidence connecting Alira to this alleged theft? Any witnesses who observed the act itself, rather than simply learning of the missing item afterward?" The silence that followed stretched uncomfortably long, and Alira watched as Edric, seated beside his mistress, shifted uneasily in his seat before finally, unexpectedly, rising to his feet. "Magistrate," he said, his voice unsteady but growing firmer with each word, "I feel compelled to speak, though it may cost me my position. Mistress Colwyn instructed me privately to fabricate evidence against Alira following the Duke's decision to employ her, hoping to discredit the girl before word of her mistreatment spread further among the nobility. I refused this instruction, but I did not come forward sooner out of my own cowardice and fear of losing my position. I can no longer remain silent while an innocent girl faces punishment for a crime that never occurred." Gasps rippled through the chamber at this unexpected confession, and Mistress Colwyn's face drained of all color as she stared at her longtime steward with an expression of betrayed disbelief. "Edric, how could you?" "Because it is the truth," he said simply, meeting her gaze without flinching for perhaps the first time in his many years of service. "And I am done building my loyalty upon lies." Magistrate Ashworth allowed the chamber to settle before speaking again, her expression grave as she turned her full attention toward Mistress Colwyn. "Given the testimony provided today, both regarding the fabricated theft accusation and the broader pattern of mistreatment described by multiple witnesses, I find no merit whatsoever in the charges brought against Alira. Furthermore, I am ordering a full investigation into the conditions within your household, Mistress Colwyn, with particular attention toward the treatment of staff under your authority. Depending on the findings of that investigation, you may face significant consequences, including the loss of your position and potential fines commensurate with the severity of mistreatment uncovered." Mistress Colwyn sat frozen in her seat, the weight of the magistrate's words settling over her like a collapsing structure she had spent years carefully building, now crumbling in the span of a single morning. Whatever protests she might have offered died unspoken on her lips, buried beneath the undeniable weight of evidence and testimony stacked against her. As the hearing concluded and the chamber began to empty, Alira remained seated for a long moment, struggling to process the sudden, overwhelming relief flooding through her. Beside her, Alaric reached over and gently squeezed her hand, and when she looked up at him, she found his expression filled with quiet, proud warmth. "It is over," he said softly. "You are free, Alira, truly free not just from this accusation but from every quiet cruelty that has shadowed you for 6 long years." Outside the chamber, the late morning sun had broken fully through the clouds, warming the stone steps where they paused before returning to the carriage that would carry them home. Alira breathed deeply, feeling something loosen within her chest that had remained tightly wound for as long as she could remember. "What happens now?" she asked, looking up at him. "Now," Alaric said, a smile finally breaking through the careful composure he had maintained throughout the difficult morning, "you begin building whatever life you wish to build, free from fear, free from punishment for simply being kind. Whether that life includes remaining within my household or eventually finding your own path elsewhere, the choice will always be entirely yours." Alira considered this for a long moment, watching the way sunlight caught in his dark hair, remembering the steady kindness he had shown her from that very first rain-soaked night in the Colwyn courtyard. "I think," she said slowly, "that I would like my life to include you, Alaric, not out of obligation or gratitude alone, but because in the short time I have known you, you have shown me what it means to be treated as though I matter." Something warm and unguarded passed across his face at her words, and he reached up to gently brush a strand of hair from her cheek. "Then let us build that life together," he said quietly, "starting today." They returned to the estate that afternoon to find Wisp waiting eagerly at the door, having grown considerably stronger and more playful in the weeks since her rescue from beneath that broken cart wheel. The small kitten who had once been near death, saved by a single act of compassion that had nearly cost Alira everything, now bounded across the garden grass with the boundless energy of a creature who had never known anything but safety and warmth. Word of the hearing's outcome spread quickly through the region, and in the months that followed, Mistress Colwyn's household underwent significant changes as the promised investigation uncovered further evidence of mistreatment spanning many years. Several servants who had suffered under her authority found new positions within households known for fair and reasonable treatment, while Mistress Colwyn herself faced consequences severe enough to finally curb the cruelty she had inflicted on those beneath her for so long. For Alira, life within Alaric's household unfolded gradually into something she had never dared imagine possible. She found purpose not merely as an employee, but as a valued and respected member of the household, her opinions sought and her well-being genuinely considered in ways that had been entirely foreign to her previous existence. The bond between herself and Alaric deepened steadily over the following months, built not upon a single dramatic rescue alone, but upon countless smaller moments of consistent kindness, patient understanding, and mutual respect that neither had experienced so fully before finding each other. On a warm evening nearly a year after that fateful storm, Alira sat once again beside the garden fountain where she had first confided her deepest fears to Alaric, Wisp now fully grown and dozing contentedly nearby in the fading sunlight. Alaric joined her as he so often did, settling beside her with the easy familiarity of two people who had built something lasting between them through shared hardship and steady devotion. "Do you ever think back to that night?" she asked him, watching the last light of evening paint the garden in gentle gold. "The storm, the courtyard, everything that happened afterward." "Often," he admitted. "I think of how easily I might have simply walked past, distracted by the trade negotiations that had brought me there in the first place. I think of how different both our lives would be now, had I chosen comfort over conscience that night." "I am grateful you did not," Alira said softly, reaching for his hand. "Grateful every single day." "As am I," he replied, lifting her hand gently to press a kiss against her fingers. "You taught me something that night I had nearly forgotten amid years of noble obligation and careful diplomacy. That true character reveals itself not in grand gestures witnessed by many, but in quiet acts of kindness offered when no one is watching, when there is nothing to gain and everything to lose." Wisp stirred beside them, stretching lazily before settling back into contented sleep, entirely unaware of how her small, desperate cry in the rain 3 nights before that storm had ultimately reshaped two lives forever, transforming suffering into strength, cruelty into justice, and a chance encounter into something that would last far beyond that single unforgettable night. As darkness settled gently over the garden, Alira found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely at peace, surrounded not by fear or uncertainty, but by genuine safety, hard-earned respect, and a love that had grown from the simplest, purest act of compassion imaginable, a starving kitten sheltered from a storm, and the courage to offer kindness even when the cost of doing so seemed impossibly high.